Hey everybody, this is Ross from Metro Gamecore. In today's video, we're going to do an Android starter guide. The idea behind this video is you'll be able to take any Android device and turn it into a dedicated gaming system. Theoretically, this process should work with phones and tablets and Android TVs, in addition to retro handheld devices that are Android based. And given the fact that this is a starter guide, most of my focus is going to be just on the overall theory and the approach to getting something like this set up. So we'll load the device up with some games and then also add some emulation apps, and then give you some suggestions when it comes to putting it all together. And there are plenty of reasons why this might be interesting to you. Number one, you might have an old Android phone lying around, and it might be of some benefit to you as a gaming machine. Also, the used marketplace for phones is a great place to shop for an Android device. For a couple $100, you could get a phone that actually is more powerful than a lot of the retro handhelds available today. And of course, there are several different handhelds that use an Android operating system as well. Probably the most notable examples are the AYN Odin, as you see here, as well as the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus and the Anbernic RG552. And so this guide is meant to help you out with those ones as well. Okay, we got a lot of ground to cover here, so without any further delay, let's jump into it. Okay, number one thing here is there is an Android starter guide on my website, and I recommend you check this out as you're getting acquainted with the whole system. This is going to go into way more detail than this video here, and it'll also allow you to go through this at your own pace. And I'll also keep this one updated as time goes on with the latest links and things like that too. And in this starter guide, I'll show you things like which systems I recommend emulating on an Android device. And we'll also talk about BIOS and my recommended files for that. And then other things like, how to set up your SD card and what front ends you have available and which ones I recommend. Now in this video, I'm going to primarily use a phone, and it's going to be this phone here. This is the LG V60. I picked this one up used on eBay for about $200, maybe $225. And this runs a Snapdragon 865, which is a fairly intensive processor here. This is a good phone for gaming. I can usually play up to PS2 games with relatively little issues. But of course, you're not just limited to phones. For example, you could use a tablet. This one here is called the Chewy HiPad Pro. And I did a review on this, but this one's also fairly good too. It can run up to GameCube fairly well. And of course, if you have a retro handheld that is Android based, this will also work out for you too. Things like the RG552, AYN Odin, Retroid Pocket 2 Plus, and even the Powkiddy X18S. While the interfaces might look a little bit different, each of these still use the same underlying Android system. Now, one of the big advantages of having a retro handheld device like this is that the controls are already baked into the device. And so it does give you a more seamless experience, but of course it does require the same amount of setup as well. So let's talk about accessories. The first thing you're going to want to have is a micro SD card. This is all going to be contingent on whether or not your Android device has the ability to use SD cards in the first place. But if it does, then I would recommend picking up something that's at least 128 gigs. These are usually about $20. If you go up to 256 gigs, it's going to be about $30, and so on. You're also going to want to have the ability to access your SD card on your computer. So you may want to get something like this. This is a micro SD card adapter. I'll have this linked in the written guide as well. Now, if your device is capable of video out, then you may want to consider something like this. This is a USB-C hub. Essentially, this could plug into your device, and then you can also plug a bunch of different other peripherals directly into it. So you could set it up to charge the device while it's plugged into this. You could also put your own micro SD card in this way, and then also plug in HDMI to, say, for example, hook it up to your TV. And this does open up quite a bit of possibilities with your device. For example, you could plug in a USB flash drive, or maybe some wired controllers and things like that. And so this won't work on every single device. Not every single one has USB-C video out, but my phone does, and so we're going to test this out as well. I think this sells for around $30. Again, I'll have this linked in the written guide. And of course, one of the most important things when hooking up an Android device is going to be how you're going to control it. And so you have a few options here, starting with a Bluetooth controller like this one. This is from 8BitDo. It's an SN30 Pro. I recently learned that the company prefers that we call it 8BitDo, but that doesn't make any sense to me. Why would they call it that when they're making Nintendo-style controllers? Anyway, moving on, you have other options, for example, a wired USB controller. And so, for example, you could plug this one directly into the USB-C hub when it's hooked up. And that'll give you a faster response time than something like Bluetooth. And if you're using a phone, then I would recommend using the best of both worlds, something like this USB-C controller here. This is made by GameSir, it's called the X2, and this is called a telescopic controller. The idea here is that you plug it directly into your phone, and then it wraps around your device and gives you a bit more of a seamless experience. In fact, this is the closest to a retro handheld that you can probably get on an Android phone. Now, there are quite a few options when it comes to telescopic controllers available for Android phones, and one of the more popular ones is the Razer Kishi, but honestly, I recommend the GameSir X2 over that one. I think the controls are superior on this one, and I also like the nice and clean design. It's kind of reminiscent of a Nintendo Switch. Another nice thing about this controller is that it has a USB-C pass-through, and this is only for power delivery, so it'll charge your phone when hooked up to it, but unfortunately it won't be capable of doing video out. Okay, so I've wiped this device clean, and I'm just going to start it up from scratch here. And of course, the setup for this is going to be the same as any other Android phone. You don't have to necessarily start from scratch like I did, but it will give you a nice fresh start. And so once you've gone through all those setup menus and you've signed your life away, you're ready to get started. And depending on the device, it's going to basically show up like a regular old phone or a tablet or something else along those lines. And so you'll want to go in and do all those basic things that you would do anyway with an Android device. Turn off your notification settings, screen brightness and screen timeout, all those things that you're just going to want to set up yourself. And that's going to vary by system, so I'm not going to really show you how to do that. Just jump into the settings and turn off your notifications, etc. But I do want to show you your setup options when it comes to storage. So we're going to take this 128 gig SD card here, and then I'm going to use a paperclip here to remove my SD card holder, and then I'll just pop it right into the device. Now often what'll happen is you'll get some sort of pop-up or a notification that'll basically say something about setting up your SD card. And this will vary by phone. For example, with this one, it only gives me the option to format it as portable storage, which is actually a little unusual. Typically, it'll ask you if you want to format it for portable or internal storage. Now, portable storage basically means it's going to format it to exFAT, and you're going to be able to take the SD card in and out of your device and plug it into your computer, load things onto it. It's very convenient. Internal storage is the opposite. It basically will only work within that one Android device, and so you can't plug it into your computer to transfer files. Instead, you have to transfer everything via USB, and that's a pretty nice setup too, although the transfer speeds will be a little bit slower. Now, I go into this in more detail in the written guide, but it does get a little bit tricky when you're using Android 11 and above. And that's because certain emulator apps won't be able to access your game files if you have it set to portable storage. And so it's going to be up to you which one you choose, and it'll really be dependent on what version of Android you're running. And there are workarounds available for that issue. Basically, what you do is you use a front end which will access the game files for you through that emulator, which you'll see later on in this video when we do the whole front end thing. And so on this device here, which is running Android 11, I have no other choice but to use portable storage. That's going to be really convenient when it comes to transferring files, but I will have to use a front end to access the games on certain emulators. Not a big deal, as you'll see later on. Okay, so now that I've added and formatted my SD card here, I'm just going to go into the settings under storage, and then I'm going to eject the SD card so I can safely remove it from the device. You could also just power off your device if you wanted. Either way, let's take this thing and put it into our computer. And as you see, it will have pre-populated some of the folders already for you. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to create our own folder. We're going to call it Games, and this is where we're going to put all of our ROM files. Now within that Games folder, the first folder I typically like to make is my BIOS folder. These are system files that are going to be required for certain game systems. Mostly all of your CD-based systems and a couple others too. Now personally, I have a collection of my BIOS files here, so I'm just going to move them directly over. And like I mentioned in my written guide, I'll have a list of all my preferred BIOS files. Now these files are copyrighted, so I'm not going to share them, but at the very least, I'll give you the names of the files that you're going to want to have. After that, it's just a matter of moving over the game files themselves. Now I already have a ROM collection as you see here, and so I'm just going to move over my standard game files. But if you're just starting out and you're not really sure where to start, what I would recommend doing is going to my written guide. In here, I'll explain most of the major systems as well as the file types that I recommend when setting it up for Android. And of course, just like with BIOS files, ROM files are copyrighted as well, so there's not going to be any links to the actual games in the written guide, but it should at least help you get started on your way to building a collection. Either way, if you get stuck at this part here, just go to the written guide and it'll explain a little bit more detail. And so yeah, once you've moved over all your ROM files, it'll look something like this. I basically have one BIOS folder and then an additional folder for each of the systems that I plan on emulating. And then within each of these, I have all of my different ROM files. So rather than staring at my hands for the rest of the video, we're actually going to set this up with that USB-C hub so that we can see everything via screen capture. So here I am plugging in the USB-C hub as well as a power cable, and then also my HDMI cable for video out. And so yeah, here we are on my phone using video out. So now let's actually start configuring this thing to make it work more like a gaming device. First thing you want to do is update the installed apps and then grab some emulation apps too. Now this will also depend on what version of Android you're using, but for me, I've already signed into my account here, and I'm going to go into my Manage Apps and Devices section, and within here, I'm going to select all of the apps that I have bought previously that are not installed on this device. Because I've set up Android before on other devices, it remembers all the ones I've downloaded previously. So I'm going to go through here and pick all of the emulation apps that I want to use on my phone. And again, these are all listed in the written guide if you've never tried this before. Either way, I'm going to get a collection of emulators, just regular Android games, and then also some game streaming apps as well. Now, a lot of these are free. Some of them have pro versions so you can like remove ads and things like that. And in the written guide, I'll also list which ones are paid and how much they cost. Okay, so now that we've downloaded a bunch of apps, let's go ahead and start organizing the phone so it doesn't look so much like a phone. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take all these system apps and I'm just going to throw them all together in one folder. Some of these you may be able to uninstall just right then and there, but for others it's going to be more complicated to turn them off. And so what I've always just found is the easiest solution is just to hide them in the first place. And so I'm not going to bore you with the details here, I'm just basically going to speed through this whole process, but as you can imagine, just take all of the apps you don't like and then put them into a folder. And then if your folder runs out of space, make a second folder and fill them all in there instead. At the same time, I recommend organizing all of your different apps that you do want. For example, I'll pick all of my emulators, put them all in one folder. And of course, this is all 100% subjective, but this is how I'm going to have it set up for myself at least. And there are ways to make it so you don't even see this screen in the first place, but for now, we're going to leave it like this. I'm going to change out the wallpaper so it's a little bit nicer looking, but yeah, here we are. I have my emulators, then my games, then all my streaming apps, and because I'm going to show off a number of different Android front ends as well, I'll also make a folder for those. But yeah, once you have that all set up, it's just a matter of kind of organizing them and designing it in a way that looks good to you. Now, not every emulator is going to be able to be found in the Google Play Store. Some of these you're actually going to want to find on the internet itself. So I'm going to open up a Chrome browser here and then download a few of them directly. For example, RetroArch is available in the Google Play Store, but if you get it directly from their website, it's going to be a more updated version. And so I'm going to grab the 64-bit version of RetroArch here. It's going to give you all sorts of pop-ups. It'll say things like, you're not supposed to install this thing. You have to go into the settings and say, yes, please be able to install it. And then it'll ask you, do you really want to install it? And then you say, of course, yeah, man, I want to do it. And you kind of want to rinse and repeat this process. There are other emulators, for example, Dolphin MMJR, which is probably my favorite emulator for GameCube because it does do a really good job when it comes to performance. And this one is not in the Google Play Store. This one you have to get from GitHub. And as you can imagine, all these links are in the written guide. So even though I'm going through this very quickly, you'll be able to download these individually if you go to the written guide on your Android device. And finally, another one that I recommend checking out is going to be the Launchbox front end, which is available on Android. Now this one is also not on the Google Play Store. What you have to do is give them an email address, and then it'll email you the link to download. From there, just check your email from the Android device and then download it that way. And so there you go. These are some of the apps that I would recommend getting, not on the Google Play Store, but directly from their websites. And so this is kind of what the final setup is going to look like. I'm going to have Launchbox here on the top left because that's the front end that I use the most. And then also ATV Launcher is an option that I'll put on the top right too, and we'll talk about that in a second. And just to reiterate here, I'm not going to spend a lot of time actually setting up individual emulators, because if I did that, the video length here would be something like 2 hours long. And I've always found that doing it via written steps is going to be a lot more intuitive as you're setting things up. Then you can do everything one at a time at your own pace. And so go to that written guide and it'll say which emulators I recommend, how to set them up in the first place, what ROM types you're going to want to use, and whether or not it requires BIOS files. And probably one of the biggest hurdles you're going to have is going to be setting up RetroArch on an Android device. And I recognized this early on, and that's why a couple weeks ago I had released a dedicated RetroArch starter guide video. And in this video and written guide, it does show you how to set up RetroArch from the very start. And so this is going going to be an essential component of getting set up as well. Anyway, that's how you're going to want to set up your emulators. Go to the written guide for the standalone emulators, and then use the RetroArch starter guide for RetroArch. And so now let's talk about Android frontends and how you can kind of change the navigation experience depending on what you prefer. We'll start with this one here. This is called ATV Launcher Pro. Now this is primarily designed for Android TV boxes. That's why you see such big tiles like this. The idea here is this is an alternative Android home screen that will allow you to use a controller exclusively to navigate everything. Now there's a free version and it works pretty well, but the Pro version is going to have some other tweaks to it. For example, you can go in and remove the widget section, so that way it doesn't have a blank space at the top of the menu. And you can also go in and select specific apps to hide. And so what I usually will do is I'll remove the widgets, and then I'll also remove all those system apps that I don't actually want to see on my front screen. And then you can also adjust the size of your tiles to give you more space to look at. And then of course organize the order of all the apps so it's more intuitive. And so this is what a typical setup on ATV Pro would look like for me. And this is a nice solution if you want to have easy access to all of your apps all at once without having to do a lot of configuration. Another front end that I've already talked about is the Launchbox front end. Now Launchbox is a well-known game file organizer that's available on Windows devices. And this Android version is kind of complementary to that. Now this one requires a little bit more of a setup. You're going to have to go in and import each of your individual systems. So you'll go in and select the folder where those games reside, and then choose what system you're going to be playing, and then you'll also have to point it to the right emulator. But this is what it'll look like when it's all fully set up. It's going to actually find all the box art and media for your games. And there's not a ton of different customization options, but there are quite a few, and this is usually what it looks like once I have it all set up. And while this is a really nice setup, it isn't free. This is a $25 app that gives you a lifetime license, but all the same, it's pretty expensive. So let's look at a couple other options. Number one is Dig. This is a completely free option here. And the nice thing about this one is that it's very easy to initially set up. All you have to do is just point it to your overall games folder, and it's going to find each of your game systems and then scrape all the media and everything else for you. And so without having to individually set up each of your systems, it's going to find them all for you and then just set it up. But there are issues later on. For example, it's kind of ugly, so you're going to have to install new themes to make it a little bit prettier looking. And on top of that, the updates for Dig are very few and far between. And so what that means is you'll have to configure some things behind the scenes to make sure that certain emulators do work properly. So very easy to set up, but not so easy to master. Now one that's in more active development is the Reset collection. This one costs $5 altogether, and this one behaves a lot like the Launchbox one. You'll have to go in and set your specific system, and then point it to the correct emulator as well as the location of the game files themselves on your SD card or internal storage. And much like with those other front ends, it'll also download all of the media art for you, and so you just have to basically set it up that one time, and then you'll be able to navigate through all of your systems. Now, like with Launchbox, this one is not very customizable. And so if you want to adjust the display more than just the default settings here, you are going to have to get into the Android file system and replace some pictures and things like that. It's not the end of the world, but it isn't the most intuitive way to update. Okay, another one we're going to test out here is called the Arc browser. And this one will typically cost between $8 and $10 depending on sales, and it also functions a lot like Reset Collection. Now there are a lot of people who really enjoy the Arc browser because you do have quite a few customization options, and they have a nice website as well as a Discord server to kind of help you along the way. And so this is what the default setup looks like here. You basically browse it by letter, but there are ways to change the theme and then customize it and things like that. And finally, there's one called Pegasus. This is a free front end, but it's a little bit tricky to set up. Thankfully, people in the community have been hard at work on something called the Pegasus installer. And this takes care of a lot of the setup for you. Right now it's set up using a terminal application, which then you can paste in a certain piece of code, which will install Pegasus and also configure everything for you. They're actually working on a standalone Android app that should be coming out in the future, and I'll be sure to make a video about that when it's ready. But for now, just go to pegasusinstaller.com and then follow the instructions. They'll have a link to the Termux app, which is a terminal command line app, and then just copy a small snippet of code, which you then paste into the terminal. And from there, it's going to run the installation script and allow you to configure everything yourself. And it seems intimidating at first, all this wall of text and everything, but it's pretty simple. You just go through and select what type of device you're using, and they have custom profiles for the RG552, Retroid Pocket 2 Plus, and the AYN Odin already. We're just going to use the generic Android one here, and it'll set up everything for you. It'll configure RetroArch for you, install all the emulators that you need, and also provide a nice graphical interface. And this is what Pegasus will look like when you have it installed. They're using a emulation station style interface here. And while I don't have any games set up right here, you can see what the navigation experience is like. And another nice thing about the Pegasus installer application is it does have a couple different themes that you can choose from within here. And so while Pegasus itself is a pain to set up in the first place, this installer app is quite helpful. But at the end of the day, I do prefer to use the Launchbox app instead. And of course, this is not cheap. This is the $25 front end I was talking about earlier. But I think in terms of just setting it up, the ease of use of getting it all started, and the fact that it is being actively developed, this one is my favorite right now. And once you have everything set up, it becomes a quite seamless experience. For example, I can navigate through the games list and then press a button to start up the game here in RetroArch. As a quick aside, one of the nice things about using the Pegasus installer is that it also installs bezels in RetroArch. As you can see here, you have these little Sega Genesis things on the left and right of the screen. And that's because I ran the Pegasus installer. This is usually a pain to set up, but the Pegasus thing really does make it easy. And of course, because I've already set up RetroArch using my starter guide, I have the ability to use hotkeys. So if I press select and start, it's going to bring me back to that Launchbox menu. And so now we've set up a pretty seamless experience. We've set up a front end that allows us to access all of our game systems, and then we've configured RetroArch to have these hotkeys which allow us to jump in and out of our games. And essentially that's the gist of setting up a device on Android. You're going to want to add those game files to your system, then install all the different emulators, and then configure all those emulators using the written instructions below, and then wrap a front end around everything so that you have a seamless experience. Now, one thing to mention, on Android you can find a lot of different individual standalone emulators, things that'll run systems like Dreamcast or PS1 and so on. But if you're using a device that's powerful enough to run all those systems in RetroArch instead, then I recommend using RetroArch, because you'll be able to do things like widescreen hacks for Dreamcast to be able to fill up the whole screen, and you can also upscale the graphics within the settings, and most importantly, you'll be able to use hotkeys to be able to jump in and out of the games. A lot of the standalone emulators don't have that as an option. And so rather than swiping on the screen of your device to be able to exit out of each game, which can become quite a pain, you can just use a hotkey to just quit out of the game and jump right back into Launchbox. And that's my preferred way of setting this up. Of course, with certain systems like GameCube and PS2, you have no other choice but to use these standalone emulators. And those emulators are great, they just don't have the ability to use hotkeys to exit out of your game. And so with certain systems you will have to do some swiping to get in and out of the game, but it's not the end of the world, but it does take away a little bit from the overall experience. Now, Android is great for more than just emulation. For example, game streaming is really robust as a platform on a lot of Android devices. So for example, you could stream directly from your Xbox, your PS4, your PS5, or you could use cloud streaming apps like Stadia and GeForce Now, or stream directly to your PC using Moonlight, Parsec, Steam Link, and so on. You've got a lot of options when it comes to streaming. This is kind of beyond the scope of the video, but it is something to think about. And of course, you can also just play Android games directly on the device as well. And some of these will give you a console-like experience. I think Dead Cells is a great example here. Either way, something to keep in mind is beyond just emulation, you will be able to stream games directly onto the device or just play native Android games. And so yeah, here's my setup here. I have a bunch of emulators in its own folder, and of course some Android games and some streaming apps, and then a variety of front ends too. But at the end of the day, this is kind of how I have it set up, a regular Android interface that can jump right into Launchbox. And so that's going to be about it for this Android starter guide. And like I mentioned earlier, it's all about setting up an internal process. Grab those game files, then the emulators, then configure everything, and then wrap it all up in one nice front end. When it comes to classic gaming, things like PS1 and below, your only real option is going to be to use RetroArch. And so definitely check out my RetroArch starter guide, which is kind of a companion piece to this overall video. And of course, without sounding like a broken record, make sure you go to that written guide for Android setup as well. That's going to show you all the individual emulators and my preferred configuration settings. And so my recommendation when it comes to your approach of setting this up is just to set aside some time to really get this working correctly. It'll be a little bit frustrating in the beginning, just kind of getting everything to work, and it's all going to be dependent on what device you're using. But either way, the fundamentals will be the same no matter what. And I hope that this video, as well as the accompanying written guide, help you on that way. And so if you have any questions or comments, leave them below and I'll try my best to get back to you. As always, thanks for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful. And we will see you next time. Happy gaming.